Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program where we talk about state government, politics, and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Charlie Wheeler, Emeritus Professor at UIS from the Public Affairs Reporting Program and longtime State House reporter. Welcome, Charlie.
It's always good to be here, even if it is virtually.
Yeah, it's nice to be in your living room too. And also Jerry Nowicki, Bureau Chief for Capital News, Illinois. Welcome, Jerry.
Yep, happy to be here with this well-bearded crew.
Well, we do what we can these days. Let's hop right to it. What's been going on recently in terms of state politics, government, that sort of thing, is leveling, or at least at some point approaching the art criticism. The Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, has said he wants to get rid of depictions of Stephen Douglas at the Capitol here in Illinois. This announcement came one day after the University of Chicago announced that it is going to get rid of, I believe, a statue of Stephen Douglas up at the University of Chicago. Douglas is not apparently as popular as he once might have been. But Madigan isn't going to stop there. He also wants to get rid of a depiction, a statue on the lawn of former Lieutenant Governor Pierre Menard, who I believe was our first Lieutenant Governor, or close to the first. Long enough ago that there were Native Americans who would kneel in front of him, apparently. He was a fur trader. And that's not the sort of depiction that we want to see now. If, in fact, Native Americans ever kneeled in front of anybody, we don't know. We weren't there, but it's not something that we want to see now or probably ever was appropriate. The Speaker also says that he wants to move a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. That is across the street from the Capitol to a, quote, more prominent location. And lastly, the Speaker says he wants a top to bottom review of all of the artwork on the Capitol grounds to determine what may or may not be appropriate and do something about what's inappropriate. Open it up. Is this almost something that had to happen anyway? Is the Speaker taking a brave step, and how far will he get?
Well, I would say it really hasn't been on anyone's radar until the recent months, with the focus on how Black people, people of color are treated in this nation by the police, by others, by the institutions. And for, well, at least 50 years, to the best of my knowledge, because that's how long I've been watching it, the portrait of Stephen A. Douglas has been over the Democratic side of the Illinois House. The portrait of Abraham Lincoln has been over the Republican side. And the theory was that Douglas at one time was the leading Democrat in Illinois. Lincoln, of course, was a figure larger than life, a martyred president. And so there was no question about that. Now, Madigan has suggested that instead of Stephen A. Douglas, it might be more appropriate to have a portrait of Barack Obama. And I think that would make sense because Lincoln was a Republican president. Obama, of course, was a Democratic president. So that strikes me as being a pretty good idea. And Douglas had a very mixed history. He was probably, at his time, he was probably the best politician in the state of Illinois. He was a state rep. He was Secretary of State for 4 months. He was on the Supreme Court for 2 months. He was in the U.S. Senate. And no one else had such a pedigree. But he also was someone who, I guess the fairest way would be, he was not concerned at all about slavery. In the debates that he had with Abraham Lincoln, one of the things he said, and I'm going to read this quote, he said, "This government was made by our fathers on the white basis, made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." And so he was portrayed as being, about the most terrible thing you could say is that he didn't pay attention to slavery. He was all about state rights. Lincoln, of course, looked at slavery as being a moral evil. And I guess to his credit, after the Civil War broke out, Douglas advocated on behalf of the Union and campaign for Lincoln and for the Union when he had been portrayed as being a Southern sympathizer. So
Yeah.
he's
I mean,
probably
that's a
not
good,
the best guy to be up there.
and it's curious. Stephen Douglas, I believe, died in 1861 or 1862 of typhoid, and his dying words are inscribed on the statue that's out front of the Capitol. And no offense to Mr. Douglas, but there were hardly as inspiring, I think, as some of the things that Lincoln had said. His dying words were, "Tell them to," I'm paraphrasing here, "tell them to obey the law and the Constitution." And so those are his dying words, and that was to his children who weren't present. So yeah, and he's credited with helping usher in some compromises that perhaps were based more on politics than anything else, that helped something close to 20 states. Yeah.
But the compromises that he helped negotiate in Washington prolonged slavery.
Right.
And he
Absolutely.
himself was a slaveholder.
Yeah.
He married the
His wife
daughter of
was.
a
He put his. Let's be clear on this. Supposedly, he put his slaves in his wife's name so that it couldn't come back on him. Which is, that is what it is.
Well, think about it. In those days, what kind of rights did women have anyway?
Right. Exactly.
So his wife's father, who had been a North Carolina colonel and had a plantation in Mississippi, passed away. The wife inherited it, and then by virtue of the way the laws were treating women, Douglas owned the slaves.
Right.
He appointed an overseer at the plantation, and the money he collected from that helped his political campaigns.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. And that was his answer at the time. Apparently, was, "I don't own slaves; they're not in my name." And I mean, I am not the level of historian as I, but that has been my understanding, that the end around the issue was that they're not really in my name.
But see, and as I say, back in those days, the notion that, oh, they're not mine, they belong to my wife, people would say, no, that doesn't work that way.
Right.
Your wife belongs to you.
Yeah. It's like campaign contributions today. Come on, you really gave the money. It's just, but I mean, that's completely different. So,
and then Menard was a slaveholder. He was a Canadian. He was born in Quebec. He came down to the Illinois country, as it was called, when it was still part of New France.
Yeah.
After it became a territory, he was a delegate in the territorial legislature. He was actually, I think he was, I'm trying to remember now, I believe he was president of the Territorial Council. And then in 1818, when we became a state, he was chosen to be lieutenant governor as a way to bring together the population of Illinois, which had a significant French-speaking population because of our historical roots, and then the English. So Shadrach Bond was the English speaker, Pierre Menard was the French speaker. And Menard had slaves all along. There was a historical publication I was reading the other day about this, and it talked about how the slaves that he had at his home, which is still preserved down in Randolph County, and at the time Illinois became a state, if you were a slaveholder, the first Constitution said, yes, you could keep them. Everybody who was in slavery, when we became under the old French system, the British system, would remain in indentured servitude, which basically is slavery, and their children too, unless you freed them. And there's no record of him ever having freed them. He had, according to the census, he had slaves. He had like 7 in 1810, 13 in 1820, 22 in 1830. As the slave families had children, the population grew, and there's never any record at all that he ever freed any of his slaves. Then finally we got it right in the Constitution of 1848 when we outlawed slavery, period.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the question for a lot of folks naturally might be, you go into the Capitol now, beyond what's there, what's not there? And that is depictions, I think, of folks of African American descent, Black people, brown people. There's very few of them. And we were talking before we started taping about women, and we weren't able to come up with, I mean, there are depictions of women in the Capitol building insofar as we were able to conjure up between ourselves, and I'd looked at it, while I was writing our column, but there aren't any women other than figures that depict virtue of like faith or fidelity, whatever you might have. There's no Jane Addams, there's no Judy Bar Topinka, there's Everett Dirksons, there's Ulysses S. Grants, but there's no women or people of color. We'll get to Martin Luther King in a second. What do we do about that, Jerry?
Well, that's kind of one of the conversations that has to be had at this point. If you look just at the art walking through the Capitol, you largely see the greatness of white men as portrayed, in the eyes of white men. There's the Treaty with Indian statue, which is a prominent place, it's a portrait. It's the one that's just larger than you can really imagine. And you have to consider what kind of message that what you're looking at there. Just with all of this, with all of the artwork, there's going to have to be a way to make it more representative of the people of Illinois. And I think just with what's going on nationally today, I think the speaker, also a talented politician, understood that these calls are going to get louder for this, and he's very good at heading things off before they try to topple him.
Yeah, he's good at heading them off, but he doesn't jump too soon. Generally, he tries to find exactly the right mark. I'm curious, maybe wrongly curious, but while we've seen the Senate President Harmon weigh in favor of what Madigan wants to do, and let's be clear, the decorations at the Capitol are a matter largely for the General Assembly to decide. The Speaker's office and the Senate President's office control the office of the architect, and to my understanding, any sorts of changes would have to come from the General Assembly. We've heard nothing from J.B. Pritzker on this. And I had written a column this week, and I had sent an email to the governor's spokeswoman asking her, does the governor support what Madigan has proposed? And I heard nothing back. Should we read anything into Pritzker's so far silence on addressing the artwork at the state capitol?
Well, I suppose he could look at it that he's very much involved with other issues, and
Sure.
It's not really his call to make, because the Capitol, the building is overseen by the legislature, as you said, and it's I think the title is the architect of the Capitol, something like that.
Architect of the state capitol, yes.
Yeah. And so if Madigan wants this to occur, it will occur.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter what Governor Pritzker says, it will occur. And I suspect that if you were to go in the House chamber today, you'd see a black shroud over Stephen A. Douglas's picture on the Democratic side of the aisle.
That might be true. I tried to get into the Capitol the other day. They wouldn't let me, so who knows?
It's locked down.
It's locked down. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Did you try your press credentials?
I have no press credentials that they would recognize at the gate. My 2001 St. Louis Cardinals seasons pass, including for press club, did no good whatsoever. So I need to get one of those as quickly as possible, I suppose. But yeah, it is the legislature's bailiwick. And if Madigan had his way, and he will get his way through a lot part of this, but what is this, I guess? When I'm wondering about it, it's what Madigan's proposal has been, it's just been taken away. It hasn't been to address what Jerry, I think, rightly brought up, this giant looming, gaping absence on the Capitol grounds for folks who aren't white males. And what do we do about that? And removing things, I think, is probably difficult to do. I mean, it's taken a long time for us to come to grips with Douglas and, you know, Lieutenant Governor Menard. What do you do when you say there's a depiction of Edward Coles, the second governor of Illinois, freeing his slaves? And two of the folks are kneeling before him, thank you. What do you do about that? I mean, is this a bucket of worms? Is this a can of worms in any ways that might have been opened here?
Well, I think
Yeah, it's gonna have to be a much more in-depth conversation than just take it down, put it in storage, whatever. And one thing that'll be interesting is how much it costs for new statues. To some extent, though, there has to be just more representation, and it's going to come with a full accounting of who these men are and what place they have in the history as we move forward. There's a lot of depictions of presidents in one of the hallways, I think. I'm sure many of them owned slaves. There's George Washington's image in the Capitol. A lot of all the ex-governors except Mr. Blagojevich.
But Ryan and Walker and Kerner, but go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's it's just going to have to be a full accounting of what image of Illinois they want to depict in that building.
Yeah, and I think the way to look at it is, unless I'm mistaken, the only monument placed on the Capitol grounds in the last 50 years dedicated to an individual, as opposed to like a memorial for policemen and firemen, was Everett McKinley Dirksen. And he's on the front lawn of the Capitol, and he's there, and there's a donkey on one side and an elephant on the other side, because he was a great compromiser. But and so those decisions were made at a time when women were second-class citizens, and when people of color were not recognized at all. If we wanted to, there are people that we could honor. How about a woman, someone like Jane Addams, for example, or Gwendolyn Brooks, or Mahalia Jackson, or Jane Byrne, or even a woman named, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's Kitahawa Pont du Sable, who was a Potawatomi woman who was married to the first permanent settler in the Chicago area, Jean-Baptiste du Sable, who, by the way, was from Haiti, and he was black, and he established a trading post there. So that would be somebody to honor, who's Native American and a woman, and very important in the history of the state.
I'm glad you brought up Dirksen, because there is, I look at that statue and maybe I see different things than others do. He reminds me on some level, I'm sorry, my history might be off here, but what sticks out about me about Dirksen, I'm not from Illinois, I've lived here 15 years. What I think strikes me about Dirksen is the tape recordings that were made during the Vietnam War when he was talking to LBJ, the president. And that's what I remember about, that's what I think of when I see that statue. And it strikes me when I see that, and when I see the Stephen Douglas statue, and I'm sorry if I'm offending any Dirksen fans here, but we seem to worship politics and longevity in public office more than ideals. And I wonder if that's appropriate and whether we should rethink that, because both of the, Stephen A. Douglas certainly 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, lost, ran unsuccessfully for the presidency, but also was a scoundrel in many ways. That's who we hold up. I wonder about putting Barack Obama, who never served in the House chamber. Why isn't his portrait in the Senate chamber? Doesn't that make more sense? Lincoln, by contrast, served in the House, but he's in the Senate. Maybe we should reshuffle some of these things, and I guess what I'm wondering about is, my guess is that Madigan isn't going to want to get into this any deeper than he needs to. And will anybody push him?
Well, but in my mind, it makes a lot of sense. And as I said before, if you look at it as in terms of presidents from Illinois, who was what would you say, the greatest Republican president? Obviously, it was Abraham Lincoln. Who was the greatest Democratic president? Obviously, it was Barack Obama. Of course, if I'm not mistaken, he's the only one. But and what about a statue honoring Ronald Reagan?
Bingo.
Yeah.
Speaking of bingo, if you think about it, we have 4 presidents now rooted in Illinois. We have Lincoln, we have Ulysses S. Grant, we have Barack Obama, we have Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
That's a card game. Let's have, you've seen the dogs playing poker thing? Let's do a statue of that. And we can have Madigan maybe being the dealer. I don't know how you do that, but I'd like to have a little more fun at the Capitol rather than these folks.
Or maybe someday Michael Madigan's picture will hang in the house.
You think? Nah.
No, it will.
It will. That's all speakers do? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I stand corrected. But I think that if you really think deeply on it, I hope folks do, in a really cooperative, thinking sense. We don't really put up statues much as often as we used to. We do walls, we do reflection pools, we do those sorts of things. And so statues almost seem they seem like a yesterday's sorts of art to some degree. Again, I'm not an art critic.
Yeah.
So there's more than statues to talk about in Illinois, of course. And Jerry, you had written a story recently on the recreational marijuana program. And what stuck out to me about that was that the state is behind where it should be. And maybe it's not just pandemic related. Tell me where we're at in terms of the licensures issues in Illinois and the revenue side of it.
Right. So, revenue's looking rosy, but as far as cannabis sales go, but the licensures, there were supposed to be new licenses on May 1st for dispensaries to get social equity applicants, those from disadvantaged communities with high arrest rates for cannabis-related offenses and child poverty, aspects like that. So there were supposed to be licenses for more dispensaries there on May 1st. And then on July 1st, they were supposed to give licenses for craft growers to break into, the growing part of it. Because really, if you want to make money and be standalone, control your own future, as one of the applicants said to me, you need to be able to grow and supply yourself. Otherwise, you're just enriching the growers that have been doing this for years, which is a largely white male-dominated industry. So a lot of these people, these social equity applicant groups, are spending a lot of money for various things because they thought they'd be able to get up and running selling marijuana starting May 1st. It's July 16th, and yesterday the governor said it's going to be 6 weeks, give or take a week or two, until these licenses are granted. So there's maybe some light at the end of the tunnel there, but it's going to be harder and harder for social equity applicants to break into the white-dominated industry, which was one of the main reasons they passed this legalization bill. It's just going to get harder the further we get from May 1 and July 1.
Yeah. I mean, the licensing process involves a pretty complicated list of, it's not easy, and folks have hired consultants to help them through this. The state apparently may have, from what I'm seeing, has it bitten off more than it thought that it was biting off in terms of scoring these applications? Because the state, to my understanding, has hired a third party to score these applications. There was no rule in place in terms of tie breaking for what if, we have, there's 75 dispensaries they're supposed to be licensed. What if there's a tie and there's many more applications than just for 75? I don't know how many total have been received. But so now there's a rule working through JCAR, and JCAR can't get that administrative rule put in place until September. Did they under or overestimate how complicated this was going to be?
I don't know. They certainly didn't expect a pandemic to shut down government and and some of the private graders that they had. There's independent graders that want to sort of grade the applications to make sure that no one with Illinois connections is getting a leg up on anyone else. Maybe, I hesitate because the pandemic, no one could have foreseen the extent everything would be derailed with this.
Fair enough. And speaking of pandemic, it's time for us to wrap up. Unfortunately, we talked maybe more about art than we should have, but I enjoyed it. The pandemic the governor gave a press conference yesterday, and almost a warning shot, I thought, across the bow in some respect, that, stay tuned, this might not be over, and what upticks could be taken seriously. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. Any rate, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week on Capitol View.